Javier Rivera. Look at Mr. Rivera right there. How you doing?
Pretty good, Daniel. Pretty good.
Good. Oh, it's so intimate. So you've been thinking about pessimism and horror and all sorts of fun things. Where your brain at been, Javier?
Um, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I've had several thoughts. But connecting it to, I think I was thinking about recently, like, let's say if we make Andrew Luber's themology like a science, right?
Mm.
Then like actually going into the themes of like horror and what is it specifically about horror that says something
Mm.
um about theme, perhaps. What is that? And I mean, obviously I already have like a natural attraction to those kind of themes, so I've just been thinking about like, oh, so what is it about horror for us as human beings? And like actually uncertainty is really tangible to horror.
Mm.
I made a comment the other day. I was like, I was watching this show and like it had these like kind of inside caves. I was like, inside caves are like sort of naturally scary in a way because you
Mm.
don't know what's inside. You don't know if the cave could collapse. You don't know there's things in there. You just don't know what's in that cave. Um,
Mm.
so caves, it seems like, are not necessarily naturally inviting, especially if it's dark. And you can't really see so much inside. So there is something horrifying about going inside, and like, why is that horrifying?
Mm.
And then other thing I've been thinking about is like when you read like horror novels, um, something so mundane can suddenly turn horrifying. Why is that? Well, there's a scene. I started reading Ligatti's work, some of his like actual horror fiction, and there's a short story where the parents are asking each other who got the teddy bear for their daughter, and they both admit that none of them bought it. Right. So it's interesting, right? Like something so innocent, something so mundane, something so given, all of a sudden turns horrifying.
Mm.
Like you have no idea where it came from.
Mm.
Right. So it's a that's been something that I've been sort of paying attention
Mm.
to. Why is it that we sort of naturally want to lay inside of givens, remain in givens, and then givens become sort of horrifying because they take on a new quality to them,
Mm.
right? And I think that's the very interesting nature of like kind of looking into the theme of horror. Something that appears so natural um, and innocent all of a sudden takes on a new nature.
Mm.
So yeah, I've been thinking about that.
Interesting. Because now, so there's a few things. First, there's some thoughts I have, like, we obviously emphasize beauty and good and things like that, but can a God be beautiful that can't be horrifying? Like, because then it almost feels like, because like in the Bible, as you know, there's stories of God doing terrible things. Is that almost like necessary for the beatific vision? Because otherwise it would feel like God is controlled by his essence that forces him to be beautiful. It's like C.S. Lewis talks about Anselm. He's like, oh, he's not safe, but he's good. Like, there's something about it. I wonder if there's something about the possibility of horror or just quietness or et cetera, so forth, that is almost a necessary possibility for beauty to have any effect, or goodness, or different things. Because otherwise there's a way in which the beauty would just kind of, I wonder if it's precisely like one of the ways they describe beauty, just in honor of to emphasize that in honor of Mr. Jockin's class coming up that everyone should sign up for. There's something about beauty being a spear. It cuts you, it stabs you. That's so funny because like a horror movie has a lot of blood and gore, right? It's interesting to think of how piercing beauty, it's piercing. Love is piercing. This is all kind of horror language. And yet in the context of beauty, it's a good thing because it gets you out of your enclosure. And it's almost like horror in a way is an opposite of beauty because it smashes through your understanding of the world, but not in a graceful way, in a way that kind of destroys you. And like there's a way in which then we get attached to givens, and the horror is the idea of losing them. Because as we were talking with the teddy bear, it's like, yeah, if suddenly I looked over and a teddy bear was flying in the air, you know, the teddy bear, it's the same fluffy, cute object, but the fact that it was floating in the air would suddenly perhaps make it startling or horrifying. Well, why is that? You know, if it was a bird flying in the air, it wouldn't be horrifying. It would have to be something of which I do not expect it to be horrifying, like a floating teddy bear, right? That would be shocking, because it's almost like I'd be curious what you think about this. In the same way that beauty has this way of unveiling to you that something is possible in reality that you did not know was possible, that the world entails possibility that discloses itself to you, and once it discloses itself to you, then it is always possible. If there's something about horror that actually does a similar thing, like, oh my gosh, teddy bears can float. What else could be wrong? Like everything suddenly melts. Like everything has a certain like, I don't know what's true anymore because this thing that has come forth shatters everything. Like horror is like if I can go to bed at night and suddenly somebody appears in my room breaking in, oh my gosh, how do I ever sleep again? Or if there's suddenly an alien outside, right? Like there's some sort of destabilization. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on that, because now I'm thinking about like the phenomenology of horror in a way. Like what are the conditions of possibility necessary for the experience of horror to occur? But please.
Yeah, I mean that's something that I've been interested in too. You know, why you know, I've been really like dealing with like, well, can beauty be horrifying? You know, that's something that I've been trying to grapple with. Like, if you're not ready for beauty, then perhaps it is horrifying.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it would be a horror in some ways. Like, and in that sense, then like horror and beauty is not completely opposite, because it's like if we knew, let's say, that teddy bears could fly or float in the air, like that just wouldn't be horrifying.
Exactly.
We would just be like, oh, that's really cool, that's really fascinating, that's really amazing, that's really beautiful, you know, whatever, like a floating teddy bear in the sunlight, and you know. But something that performs a function that was not supposed to perform, that is horrifying. You know, you see this in children movies, right? Like the child gets terrified because the vacuum cleaner starts speaking. You know, it's like, what? You know, what I assumed was reality is not reality, and that's horrifying. So yeah, I mean, it's just like, you know, and I mean, there's many more questions, and the other thing that I've been thinking about is like becoming in relation to death, because I've picked up Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer has some really interesting takes. But the one thing that kind of got me thinking was like, okay, well, if for Nietzsche everything is becoming and there's appearances, he doesn't actually talk about death that often, which is interesting. Like I've read already quite a few of his works, and death is not really mentioned in Nietzsche too much. It's more about, you know, change, creativity, you know, and then of course there is, I mean, there's an element of death, you could say, like maybe destruction. There's definitely destruction, element of destruction in Nietzsche, but he doesn't really talk about death. And I was thinking like, okay, so what's the relation between becoming and death? Because it almost seems like, and this is like, I don't know if it would be a jab against Nietzsche, I don't know, but like it almost seems that if it's all becoming, then death is insignificant, right? If it's just all becoming, death is insignificant. But like there seems to be something about death that is significant, and that seems to limit or put into the framework of becoming a little bit differently. Like it almost makes becoming horrifying, which would then make sense. Why is becoming horrifying? Because of death. But Nietzsche doesn't talk about death that much. He talks more about creation and then, devaluing, destructing the values. But like, yeah, I mean, that's just something I've been thinking about, because I do think it might have to do with the element or the phenomenology of horror, like becoming in relation to death. Schopenhauer talks about like, one of his arguments in his later essays is like, well, animals don't really have the knowledge of death because they don't really have the faculty of reason. Like they don't really have like that fear innately. They just maybe have like the fear of pain and suffering and so on, but like the actual knowledge of death is not necessarily being aware of, but it's because we have faculty of reason that we can actually be like, oh yeah, death is something that is coming.
Right.
Death is coming for us. So it's interesting looking at the human being in relation to the animal, even though we are animal, but it's like there's a part of consciousness that almost seems to be like like a curse. Like it's like consciousness is a horror. It's a horrifying. The more you know, the more you understand, like you don't know. And then it starts to make sense about why we like givens and why we like limits and why we like things to be in a certain framework and so on. Because if not, then everything would be horrifying. I'm like, what is that? What is that? Yeah, I don't know. Those are just the thoughts.
Well, that's very interesting because there's a few things. One, can God be horrified? Like, or is because God is aware of all possibilities of everything that can occur, does that mean God can't be horrified? Maybe it can be sad, maybe it can be jealous, maybe it can be happy. But there's an interesting idea on if you were all powerful, if you knew everything that was possible, could you be horrified? The other thing I'm thinking about is, can someone with Alzheimer's be horrified? Because there's something about realizing that this has no reference point that seems to require horror. Like it's like you can't frame it in anything pre-existing. So I'm wondering if someone with Alzheimer's or lack of memory can be horrified. Like, because there also, interesting enough, seems to be a difference between, like, I think a lot between, there seems to possibly be a difference between scared and horror. Like, what's the difference between Lovecraft and like a jump scare? Like in a jump scare in a horror movie, like bad horror movies kind of tend to be filled with these they're more like scares. But horror is like Lovecraft, which is like, oh my goodness, like these kind of beings of which are indifferent to human. I think Lovecraft calls it cosmicism. That kind of horror has some sort of ontological displacement, which seems kind of deeper than just a jump scare. And that's interesting because that would then destroy your givens. Oh, you thought humans were important? Well, turns out there were these divine beings that couldn't care less about the human race. And that's why Lovecraft is so horrifying, because it's almost like a ontological displacement, not merely a jump scare. And so, like, there's also something about kind of horror, because I wonder how much horror is tied to the knowledge of the inescapability of experience. Like, once you experience something, you can't unexperience it. And so if something happens, like if like something terrible occurs, you can never forget it, unless you get Alzheimer's maybe, or you get a head injury, right? And so it's almost like horror, because it is interesting. I had not noticed that Nietzsche does not speak of death very much. That's a very interesting observation, Javier. Very nice. There's something in which I wonder, actually, if we make a big mistake to conflate the fear of death with horror, because horror seems to have something else going on than merely the fear of death. It's almost like horror is it's tying to a feeling of the possibility of being trapped in an experience. Like, once something occurs, you can't unexperience it. And so then you want givens, and you want, I'm not, like, it's interesting because if you have givens and you have stability, you might be scared of death, but I'm not sure if you're horrified of death. Like, because like death, if your world is held together, you know you're going to die. The death comes and you're scared of it, but there's not like there's not like an ontological destabilization that occurs. Um, Horror, which could entail death, has some sort of ontological reckoning, some sort of shaking, some sort of, and maybe that's why there's, and I'll give it back to you in a moment. It seems like maybe that's why there's something thematic about this, because in the same way that beauty strikes, breaks you out of your enclosure, and you must change your life, it's almost like horror shows up, breaks through your enclosure, and says the world's not what you thought. Like instead of maybe that's like the difference, where beauty is like you must change your life, this kind of inspiring thing. Horror is like the world's not what you thought. And now you can't unknow the world is not what you thought. And now you realize you have no idea what to think. Maybe that's the double move. This the world is not what you thought, and you have no idea what to think. Like that trap, and you're trapped. You know, you're trapped in this, wow, things are not what I thought, and I don't know what to think. There's this trap that occurs there. But let me give it to you, Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, no, I mean that makes sense to me. I mean, like we are afraid of death, but like life gives the appearance that death is very far away from us. You know, so in that sense, we're like not actually horrified of death. You know, this is something like Schopenhauer and a lot of other people talk about, like Ligotti. Like Ligotti actually gives like a very interesting philosophical thought experiment where he says like, okay, if like we are afraid of death, but like would it be actually as scary if we would die always immediately? Like it was always felt without pain. It was just instantaneously, right? You could never predict when. It was just always instantaneously, right? And so that means you would just live your life, and then all of a sudden, poof, you're dead. Like you'd have no acknowledgement that there is the dying happening. You'd just be gone. And so, like, would there actually be any fear then? And like, and actually, that's when I thought, like, okay, well, like maybe then fear of death then is perhaps not actually horrifying, but like what might be horrifying is like how long I would endure in the suffering of knowing that I am dying, right? And that means that it's, and I guess you could say like maybe this is the element of horror actually, because the element of horror is when it starts transitioning the being into a world that is seemingly unknown, right? And so if you're dying, then you are transitioning into that state of non-existence, which is horrifying. And that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense why it's horrifying. Because you are aware of you're leaving, you're fleeting this immediacy. And then so yeah, I mean I do think like horror does that element of that does that double move of like this is not a world that you thought you knew. And it completely undoes everything. And you're sort of lost and sort of just like caught off guard by what the world actually is. And it's funny, like when you see like horror movies, like even after the horror, they still have like the echoes of it, you know? Like there's like the innocent stranger that comes up and they you know they get spooked because it was the same thing that the other guy did, you know. I mean, this is what we would call trauma, but like that is the horrifying element. You know, you can't like you said, you can't untake it. It seems to take it. And then there's an element of like, and in this case, forgetfulness sounds amazing, you know, at the unconscious. And Ligotti makes an interesting argument for the unconscious and like, can we be aware of our own self-deception? And I think if you tie it in with the unconscious, it's like, well, unconscious is what allows us to keep deceiving ourselves in some way, right? Until, I don't know, until we are ready to encounter the horror. I don't know. I mean, that's the question that I've been thinking.
No, that's very interesting because on that idea of if you were to die instantly, would you fear it? It makes me think, I think it's Dostoevsky in his book Demons. He says that the fear of death is actually the fear of pain, where you're afraid of the pain you would feel on the way to death, and that it's the process that actually is more so what you fear versus the instantaneous vanishing. And I think that's very good. And it makes me think of if could beauty be meaningfully distinct from pretty if there wasn't a process? Like why beauty is so impactful is precisely because there's a mystery. But the mystery means there's something you don't entirely apprehend. So there needs to be some sort of temporal dimension, some sort of process in order for beauty to be a mystery, ergo, something more than merely aesthetically pleasing. Well, likewise, it seems as if horror requires a temporal dimension, like some sort of process where you start to get pulled into something and you can't stop it. Like if it was instantaneous, you were dead, that would be one thing. But it's the continuation and not having control over the process that's really problematic. I mean, it also makes me think of too, like, if I think of Beatrice and Dante, like the only way that like God can be glorious is if there's a risk of Beatrice smiling too much and being a Lovecraft creature who turns Dante into into ash, right? The whole structure of the Paradiso as a developing grace only can be beautiful because there's always the risk of the thing turning into a complete horror at any moment. And that's why it's so glorious when it doesn't. So it's very interesting where these kind of deep divine experiences require the possibility at any moment of turning into a horror you can never escape. And then being stuck in. That temporal dimension of horror, because there's a sense in which beauty requires a temporality, lack requires a temporality. There's a way in which horror is also more temporal than spatial. And that temporality has this kind of pulling you in. That seems part of it. And I think also what's interesting, and then I'll give it back to you, is I think like when we take Nietzsche's, because I'll reference Nietzsche because of what you're saying on this idea of the eternal return, where you could say to the, the angel, you're a blessed creature. I'm so glad to learn I'll relive all my moments forever. Or it's a demon because I have to relive all my moments forever. I think the horror is the realization that it's not so simple in the sense that things can happen to you outside your control, that then if there was an eternal return, you'd have to always experience it. And well, I guess horror is the uncertainty. I'd be curious what you think about this. Is horror the uncertainty that there are things that could occur that if there was an eternal return would always be hell and never be blessed? Like, is it possible for there to be experiences of which you could never be grateful for or never find beauty in? Like, it would seem like everything can be beautiful under the right conditions, but once a given thing happens in a certain unconditioned way, it creates a horror that then is unescapable. Like, is that part of what horror is, this kind of cosmic reckoning that something might occur, that there really is there's no way for good to come out of it. You're just stuck in it forever. But then again, maybe the religious idea is, no, there's always the possibility of grace. But like the horror is, well, if you find out it's too late to go back, if it turns out that's not true. Like maybe that's a part of it too, where horror is a feeling of, I'm going into something and I won't be able to come out of it. Like, so there better be a way to redeem it, but then there's no guarantee that it will be redeemable. And maybe if it is, it'd be like Kafka says, oh, sure, there's salvation, there's heaven, just not for us. This kind of idea that maybe there is always the possibility of even taking a horror and transforming it into a beauty. But maybe not for us because we're not conditioned to be prepared for that horrible thing that occurs. And so I wonder, so I'm now thinking like the relation of horror and the eternal recurrence, this notion of beauty having a temporal dimension, whereas beauty could not be beauty if it gave itself to you all at once. Likewise, death could not be horrible if it gave itself to you all at once. It has to have a certain temporality. But then, funny enough, going back on all these religions, the things that are beautiful also can be horrifying. Like, it's the same ontology in a way. Like Krishna can be horrifying if he transforms into his true self. Sivya, God can be horrifying, right? Like, is it possible, like, what is the ontology, the ontological condition of what seems to emerge to both horror and beauty relative to different conditions. Like, what is that deeper? You could say lack, lack is the possibility of horror and beauty, but why does lack come to be experienced that way? Is it time? Is it temporality? If we say it's time, then it's time because you can't reverse time. Like, time is the pulling into something you can't come out of. That's why it can occur. And the reason something is beautiful then is because you find yourself before something you didn't choose, but it's good. And so the glory is, oh my gosh, it could have been bad, but it's not. But horror is that something's occurring to you didn't choose, and now you can't get out of it, and it's bad. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Rivera.
Well, I mean, that's a good, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, horror in relation to beauty, and like this is something that I'm kind of thinking about too, is if we call something, I mean, like you gave the hint right there, like if Krishna, let's say, revealed its true form, like it's horrifying, and it would be horrifying. The question is why? Right? Like, why would it be horrifying? And it seems like, and this is the part I think the condition somehow necessitates deception in a certain way. Like we need a certain degree of deception, and it's like because, and this is something actually Legati kind of referenced in his own like first philosophical work, which is like, okay, if we accept determinism, he's like, well, the one thing we can't free ourselves from is the feeling that we feel free. That's the one thing that like that's still kind of like inevitable. Like we still feel free. Like, and I actually found his argument very interesting because he is like a determinist, but he's actually saying like determinism is kind of impossible in the sense of like, well, you still feel free. So, and why? Why would we still need to feel free? And that feeling seems to be encapsulated by the fact of that we need this deception, because if the deceptions were to all go away, they would destroy us. Like we would go insane, we would go mad. And so, and this is actually something that even like Nietzsche always advocates for, like like it's not a will to truth, it's like a will to deception. Why would it be a will to deception? Because it does seem like consciousness has to limit things, because if it didn't limit things for us, then everything would be horrifying. Now the question is, how does deception, horror relate to then beauty? I'm hesitant in calling beauty a deception because it can be horrifying, right? Like, so it can't just be it can't fully be a deception. But it would seem to be, and maybe this is the trick, like it would seem to be maybe the necessary deception in which if you were to fully, like beauty would then be like a mercy almost, like a mercy of it unveiling to a human being, because if it were to delimit itself, it would be just utterly horrifying. So I wonder about that, actually. I'll be curious about your thoughts about that, like beauty's relation to deception, because obviously like deception definitely has to do with lack, and Jockin has gone through great efforts to argue about this. Like, if you look at art, you can manipulate the shadows, you can make faces, and like that's wonderful art, but like also that's manipulating our senses, and we don't like having our senses manipulated. We don't, because then that reveals to us that we can be fooled. But that also leaves open the possibility to encounter beauty. So we're really in quite of a predicament there, because then we won't be able to encounter something like, jaw-dropping art and something that can capture us and move us, if it weren't for some type of manipulation, some type of deception in there. And I guess it might have to be the challenge might actually be in the way we understand deception as like almost like a kind of moral wrong. right? Like, is deception in itself inherently evil? I think that's really what we're fighting against when we're trying to link beauty and horror together. And I think it has a lot to do with deception.
Excellent. So some thoughts come to mind. What's the difference between limit and deception? Like if you were limited, because I like this point that if you were unlimited, it would be horrifying. It's kind of like if they, you'll hear people say if you had eternal life, that would be horrifying, right? So that's the argument where eternal life in God has to be some kind of flow state where the idea of time goes away. Because if you have eternal life and the idea of time exists, it would be a kind of torture. So there's an interesting way in which, what is the difference between limitation and deception? Where maybe deception is a kind of holding back to keep you from, where limitation is a holding back to enable you to. And then like horror, maybe horror emerges when the thing that's supposed to limit you to enable overestimates you or goes too quickly or it's not at the right rate or something. So now I'm thinking about the difference between limit and deception. Well, yeah, I mean, like, is Beatrice deceiving Dante to not smile? Is God deceiving man to hide himself? It's like, well, no, it's actually love. There's grace. Like Dante and Flannery O'Connor, they kind of emphasize God holds himself back out of love because if he didn't, it would kill us all. Like God would be hell if he didn't hold himself back, basically. Was that deception? It's like, well, no, it's limitation so that we can experience God and it be beautiful. Because otherwise it would be a horror. So it's almost like, so this is what's interesting. Like, does the meaning of life or whatever require horror, the possibility of horror? Like, because otherwise there couldn't be glory. Like, traditionally there are also differences between sublime and beauty, like in Edmund Burke. Sublime is more tend to this kind of, you could frankly say kind of this kind of drive of excess that overwhelms you and you erupt with this excess because it's interesting too. The more I think about, like, there's something about horror, like some of the things that's horrifying is the realization that like you get so much pleasure. There's a certain point where the pleasure turns into a horror and you blow up or something, right? Like I wonder how much horror and excess are tied together now. Like, like there's something, you get a chocolate cake, like that scene out of Matilda, right? Like from long ago, 1996 movie or whatever, he gets a chocolate cake. But then he's given another chocolate cake and he has to eat it. And it's like horrifying. It's like unforgettable because it's like, oh my gosh, that thing that he liked has now turned into a horror because of excess. So it's not limited. And by not being limited, it becomes a certain horror that kind of emerges. So maybe there's something where horror is the realization that good things can be a terror. Well, then, oh my gosh, then stay away from good things. No, then there are no good things. So maybe horror is a certain realization that I was always at risk. I didn't know I was at risk, and now I am. There's also a way in which kind of horror proves the existence of an external world, doesn't it? Like in the way that you can be horrified, which means that there's something outside of you. Like it's confirmation of otherness. And it, they say anxiety is the only emotion that doesn't lie. There's a way in which horror doesn't lie, and horror actually confirms that there's something beyond you. And that's also horrifying because that means there are things with agency beyond you that could destroy you. Whereas beauty kind of suggests there's agency beyond you that can uplift you or pull you out of yourself or elevate yourself. So it's funny to think, like, I liked how you asked, like, why is something horrifying? Like, why is something beautiful? It seems like it has some sort of greatness to it in a way, some sort of overwhelm to it, some sort of like higherness to it. Because I'm also thinking, like, is a lion horrifying? I'm not sure. Like, it's interesting here because a lion, if it's out to attack you, it's more scary, but like Lovecraft is horrifying. Or finding out, like when you find out there's like a crime ring that's abusing people, like, or kidnapping them and putting them into the sex trade. There's something about that horror that seems different than the lion or the lightning bolt. Like the horror is like, the horror of like someone who's kidnapping people for a sex slavery is almost like people can do that. Oh my gosh, people can do that. How do I trust anyone? Whereas with a lion, it's just dangerous. So what's the difference between danger and horror? What's the difference between those things? Like horror is a revelation that the ground of being has spikes in it or is unstable. I'm throwing out a lot of thoughts because it's very interesting. In that play Hecuba, which Martha Nussbaum talks about, there's the idea that this woman Hecuba, she leaves her son to her best friend, and when she comes back, she finds that her best friend has murdered her son, stolen everything, and left him in the water. And there's a way in which this is horrifying, not merely bad, but it's horrifying. And she looks around and says, nothing I see is trustworthy. And I'm very interested by the relationship of trust and horror. Because it seems like horror horror is some sort of revelation that your entire life is dependent on trust, and you can't trust, and trust isn't guaranteed. Like you trusted something and it broke through and was different than you thought it was. So there's a relationship between trust, and maybe that comes back to deception in this way, because deception is veiling to break your trust against your trust, whereas limit is veiling so that you can trust, because otherwise you couldn't understand. So maybe there's something about trust in that. And maybe then, as a last point, then I'll give it back to you, we've really done ourselves a disservice by emphasizing death as the worst of all possible things, because death isn't really a matter of trust. Death is a matter of inevitability. It's just process. It's just what's going to occur. Whereas the scariest things, well, the most horrifying things seem to somehow involve our trust, our commitment to them, our relation to it. Death is not a thing in life, as Wittgenstein said, right? So there's a way in which we don't have a relationship to death. I mean, we do and we don't. The idea of death, oh, I didn't even comment on it, but I really like that point where we seem like we have no choice but to feel free. That's really interesting. I wonder if there's something where we have no choice but to be at risk of horror, or else we wouldn't exist. But anyway, by emphasizing death, we are suggesting that inevitability is the worst thing that can happen to human beings, when really what seems to be the worst thing that can happen to human beings has something to do with the things that they trusted deceiving them or blowing up or not being the way of things. Like melting, there's like a melting quality to horror. Like there's something that melts away or melts off or goes away that can never be recovered, that is different from inevitability. And that really then, you see, there's also a way in which if our emphasis is on death as the worst of all possible things, then the way you address that is coming to accept inevitability or coming to terms with inevitability. But if horror is your emphasis, then you have to condition yourself for surprise and the unexpected. And maybe there's a way in which we've emphasized horror to avoid maybe we've emphasized death to avoid horror. Like, because horror is too horrifying. We rather emphasize death and inevitability, because if you emphasize horror, well, that's too horrifying. That's too surprising. That's too unexpected. And then that threatens trust. And without trust, there's nothing. Like without trust, there's basically nothing. Like if you can't trust the world around you to be what it is, how do you even function? And horror is that revelation that things may not be what you thought they were. So then it paralyzes you even if you keep living. Maybe that's part of it. Like the horror of horror is a certain paralysis of being that goes on even if you keep being, whereas death is the end of being. Okay, well, that's the end of being. But horror, you keep being, but you have no grounds for being, because you found out that the grounds of trust is not trustable. I'm not sure. Let me throw it back at you, Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, this is the interesting part. Like, I want to clarify a little bit. Like, when I was thinking about like Nietzsche and talk about death, I mean, like, I was kind of meaning like Schopenhauer and like Bugatti and all them. This is like the pessimist stance, right? Like, basically, the pessimist stance is like we prefer non-existence over existence because existence is horrifying. Like, and their argument is like, well, think about before you were born. Like, you were in an infinity of non-existence before you're born. And then now you're in this little blimp of like horror, right? And where you suffer, toil, work, and so on. And you try to distract yourself from perhaps the horror of life and everything. And then you die. And then you go back into a second infinity. But like, what I found interesting is like, yeah, fear of death is interesting because it's like, in a weird way, it's like, why? Why would you fear the inevitable when, in fact, when you really think it through, like you probably prefer non-existence over the surprises and suffering of things. But I was thinking more about this limit and deception distinction, which I really was really fascinated by, because I was thinking like, limit seems to be like the lion conversation is fascinating because we know lions can attack you, can be dangerous, and that is scary. But that's like a known scary thing, right? Like that we know the risk coming into the situation. So in that sense, like a lion isn't really horrifying. Now, if a lion were to have gotten up, started talking, grabbing a gun, and started shooting people, that would be horrifying. That would be horrifying because now we have to question everything about what we know about lions. We have to question how did this happen? This has never happened before. So that's a very interesting line between limit and deception, because it seems to be like deception is the very unknown limit that was concealed from itself, right? Like you didn't know that was the limit until the limit is revealed. Like once the limit is revealed, it is horrifying. And it is at that moment a deception. But like once you know that lions can get up and grab a gun, like then we're like, okay, like we can do things to mitigate it now. It's less horrifying. It starts to become less horrifying because now it becomes the nature of things as they are. And so like this is like the whole thing of just like the like Planet of the Apes, right? Like you entertain a world like where the apes like get up and talk and like start grabbing guns and like rage against humanity, like that is horrifying. But it then becomes like a part of the status quo. Like it starts easily collapsing into like, okay, this is our world now. So then it's not horrifying. So it's a very interesting phenomenology of what we would call deception limit, because limit would seem to be like limit is acceptable as limit or can only be known as limit once we are aware of it, right? If not, it's a deception. We don't actually know it's a limit until we are deceived and realize it, and that's the interesting horror thing. But unfortunately, I have to go, Daniel. I have work, and I know this is such a good conversation. I hate to end it here, but
no, don't worry. I appreciate you jumping in with work obligations. And I don't want to get you fired because that would be horrifying because your world would melt below you, not merely scary or something. But no, I just as a note, I'm interested. It's like horror has to be between worlds. Like horror, like I think this is a very good point. Like if monkeys start using guns, you're like, okay, that's what monkeys do now. It has to have a kind of transition impact on it. But then once the transition is over, you know what to trust or what not to trust. So there's a reset that occurs. And now I'm wondering if also where horror destroys trust, beauty shows you the world is not what you thought it was, but it doesn't destroy your trust. It shows that the thing you trusted has more to it in a way that suggests your trust pays off, whereas horror makes you feel like your trust didn't pay off. Like there's more to the world and your trust deceived you. Whereas with beauty, your trust was limited, but not destroyed. There might be a difference there, but I appreciate all of those thoughts and differences, Javier Rivera. I will let you go. Thank you, sir, for your time. I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. Actually, I really like that. I would like to explore about this for sure.